Namaste, good morning, good afternoon, or good whatever time of day it is in the US as you hear this. I'm going to talk today about how philology or historical linguistics has been used as a tool to rewrite our history. Indian history prior to 1000 BC has essentially been written by philologists and linguists or so-called Indologists. We tend to blame leftist historians, but it's not so much them, they were just the followers of these people who started this business. 200 years ago, there were no Aryans, there were no Dravidians. No one was saying that my ancestors came from abroad riding on horses, and no one was saying our people were subjugated by invaders. But now we learn that there were people called Aryans, the Aryans came from outside India, and that they brought their language to India. Well, this language thing is critical. We need to remember that. That was the thing. That was this whole business of Aryan migration is necessary to bring the language to India. Let me expand on. In the early 19th and 20th centuries, the European view of their history was based on the Bible and something from what the Greeks had written. Now, in the Old Testament, in the Bible, there's this story about a fellow called Noah. Apparently, this man was the father of all mankind, and he rescued all animals in a boat from a flood. So Noah had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Now, apparently Ham saw his father naked. He might have seen him having sexual intercourse, nobody is sure about that. But in any case, Noah cursed his son Ham and said all of Ham's descendants would be slaves. And in those days, of course, black people were slaves, and so black people were all called Hamites. Noah's son Shem had descendants who became Semites, the Jews and the hated Arabs. The Jews were hated too, of course. And it was the sons of Japheth, the Japhethites, who were the favored people. They were not yet called Aryans. There's a small mistake in that slide. In any case, around that time they started finding these fantastic ruins in Assyria. Assyria, as you know, is parts of Syria and Iraq where the current ISIS conflict is taking place. So how could the hated Semites claim greater antiquity than the favorite sons of God, the Christian Japhethites of Europe? Sanskrit provided the answer. Until the Europeans started learning Sanskrit, they knew that European languages were somewhat related. They somehow thought that these languages came down from some biblical language. But Sanskrit gave them the answer, and it gave them the antiquity they wanted. As Muller said, Sanskrit stepped into the midst of these languages, and there came the light and warmth of mutual recognition. From Sanskrit, they realized all the links between European languages, because there were common words between Sanskrit and all European languages. So the links became very clear. But there was still a problem. Why was this most highly developed language found among dark-skinned Hamites who would ordinarily have been dubbed slaves? So the theory came up that the Sanskrit language must have come to India with Aryans from Europe, and those Aryans got corrupted by something in India. So history was invented for Europe and India, where the word Aryan was coined from the word Arya in the Vedas. Now Arya is a word that just means noble people. And the European Aryan race was invented to explain the well-developed language in India. And a Dravidian race of corrupting black non-Christians was invented. And these were the people who apparently corrupted the great Aryans who had come to India. And this is the history we believe. Now there was this man called Thomas Huxley who in 1890 wrote, he was a science man. He said the Aryan invaders were white men. They intermixed with the dark Dravidian aborigines. And the one below that says Living Races of Mankind, that was a book that my grandfather had. I still have it on my bookshelf, on my left over here. Now, apparently that book says that these Vedic Aryans received a deep taint from Dravido-Colerian aborigines. So this was put down as history. After World War II, the racist word Aryan was discarded. Indo-Aryan became Indo-European, but nothing else changed. The search for the origins of the language continued outside India. It couldn't be in India for various reasons. So one of the things that was done was to conjure up a group of people carrying language to India. So the linguists said that the Aryans who were going to India were speaking a language called Proto-Indo-Iranian. Now apparently these Proto-Indo-Iranian speakers were going towards India, and then they split up into two groups. And one group went west into Iran, and they became Zoroastrians. They composed the Zend Avesta, and they were apparently speaking a language called Avestan. And another group went east towards the Indus River, towards the Punjab region of India, and they composed the Rig Veda. So this is how history was written for us. What is the evidence that such a migration actually took place? Well, there's no evidence at all. That apart, there is not even any reference in any ancient Zoroastrian text to a language called Avestan. Philologists have created Avestan out of Sanskrit and Persian texts recorded 1500 to 2500 years after Zarathustra. Now the things that philologists ignore, and even though this is all recorded information, the Rig Veda and Zenda Vesta are both orally transmitted, or they were both orally transmitted until for many thousands of years. And they're both hymns. They're both a set of hymns that are set to a unique metrical scale. Anyone who's heard the Rig Veda being chanted will know this. And the Zenda Vesta of the Zoroastrians is similar. And the interesting thing is, Rig Vedic deities are mentioned in the Zenda Vesta, but not vice versa. That is to say that the deities of the Zenda Vesta are not mentioned in the Rig Veda, suggesting basically that the Zenda Vesta is a little younger, little later than the Rig Veda. Now the deity called Varuna in the Rig Veda becomes the god Ahura Mazda in Zenda Vesta, and Indra of the Rig Veda is an evil force in Zen. So they're both deeply connected. Parsi and Vedic scholars have this to say. It is said that Zoroastrianism basically arose from a dispute between two Vedic rishis, Rishi Bhrigu and Rishi Angirasa. Rishi Bhrigu was an Atharvan. An Atharvan is a fire priest, and he split off from the Vedic tradition. The Zenda Vesta is actually the Zonda Vesta or Chand Upastaka, or the hymns book. The Zenda Vesta is also so similar to the Atharva Veda that a man called Jatendra Mohan Chatterjee points out that the Indian Atharva Veda is only the Angirasa half of the Atharva Veda, and the lost Bhrigu half is actually the Zenda Vesta. So the so-called Avestan language was reconstructed by philologists from these ancient texts. And although the text of the Zoroastrians was designed to indicate phonetic values, these phonetic values had all changed in these many centuries that followed the death of Zarathustra. Now we need to remember that this so-called Avestan language and the Aryan migration theory are merely supporting actors in a grand theory of how European languages came from a magnificent mother language. Now, if we tend to think that in fact we get blamed for being Hindutva-vadis for making such claims. On the other hand, you look at this man, and this man Mallory is widely quoted. Nowadays you'll find him quoted in almost any genetics reference. And he said in 1973, the location of the homeland and description of how the Indo-European languages spread is central to any explanation of how Europe became European. In a larger sense, it is a search for the origins of Western civilization. Now you can see why this Indo-European languages are so critical to the Europeans and how they want to grab and keep Sanskrit, because it's their history that they are searching for, and they don't really care if they make up history for us Indians. It's up to us to figure out what is the truth. Now, continuing with the theme of how this language is supposed to have come to India from somewhere outside, many of you may have heard of what is called as the Mitanni Treaty. This treaty document was in a set of tablets in the cuneiform text found in Syria, dated to about 1500 BCE. Now the Mitanni kings had names like had basically Sanskrit Rigvedic names like Svardata, Subandhu, Indarota, Birya, Arthadama. So these were very, very clearly Sanskrit names. Also, you find that the Mitanni treaty had the names of about 35 or 40 Hurrian, local Syrian Hurrian gods. And among them, there were four names of Vedic deities: Mitra, Varuna, Indra, and the Nasatya twins. The interesting thing is the Nasatyas are considered twins only in the Rig Veda. Now, in order to find out how these cuneiform texts of Syria were translated, we need to see the route by which these translations were done. Now, initially they found in a place called Bagastana. It used to be called Bagastana. It's now Behistun in Iran. They found very high up on a mountain trilingual texts. Now, a man called Rawlinson came from India. He had learned some Sanskrit, and then he looked at these trilingual texts, and he made a connection between one of them and Old Persian, which is similar to Sanskrit, and he translated the Old Persian text. And since there were the cuneiform texts also had next to the Old Persian text Akkadian language, they managed to translate the Akkadian language text as well. But you see the route by which this has happened. First Sanskrit to Old Persian to cuneiform Akkadian. Cuneiform script is not something that can simply be converted into phonetic sounds. Now, if you look at the Sanskrit text, you can find that the pronunciation is very, very clear. It says, Aham Mitra Varunobha Bibharmi, Aham Indragni, Aham Ashvinobha. Now, the cuneiform text is a logographic text. So basically, you don't get it exactly like that. Mitra is spelt as Mi-itra Asil, and Varuna is spelt as Uaruana Asil. And the letters Dingirmez is something that's just written, it's not pronounced. It means either god or gods. So the comparison between the Vedic and the Hurrian is quite different. You're not actually, in the Vedic we have the original phonology, the sounds. In the Hurrian you don't have that. So it's very difficult to judge the grammar and content of a language from a translation such as this that has come through cuneiform text. But that has not stopped the linguists. Now, what these people are claiming is, way out in the west, in Syria, there were people who already knew about Mitra, Varuna, Indra and the Nasatya twins. And then in 500 years they went to India. And the funniest part is, they went to India through Iran. Now, Iran actually had Zoroastrianism that came later, where Varuna was the god and Indra was evil. So somehow these Syrian people who considered Indra a god went through Iran, and then they didn't stop in Iran at all. They went all the way to India where they got established, and then magically the Zoroastrians appeared, hating Indra in the middle and making Varuna their main god is Ahura Mazda. This story is so far-fetched, it is our fault for believing this sort of stuff. So next we come to a problem that still remains after all this. The problem is there's this ancient language that's found in India, but there's no similar language of similar antiquity found outside India. So what's the solution for the European linguists? They have to somehow link archaeology with language. And in the linking of archaeology language, they are to ignore any inconvenient archaeology and use selective evidence from the texts. So the theory goes like this. Horses were domesticated in Eurasia in 4000. What is Eurasia? Has anybody found out what Eurasia is? In any case, horses were domesticated in Eurasia in 4000 BC. And apparently these people who domesticated horses also invented chariots. Very good, bright people. And to top all this, they also apparently used to speak a precursor language of Sanskrit. Now, this is a complete fabrication. There's no evidence whatsoever. There's no text, there's no tablet, there's no narrative. There's nothing to indicate that they spoke anything, any language. I'm sure they spoke some language, but the idea that it was a precursor of Sanskrit is basically nonsense. Now, apparently these people they hitched their horses onto their chariots and they rode all the way to India, reaching by about 5,500,000 BC, which is again an assumption. Now, how did they make this link? This is what they did. They said in Eurasia, in a place called Andronova, there were these graves, there were these three-story graves. And in these three-story graves, you have horses buried at the bottom level, and there are pillars and walls and a roof. And on top of that roof, royalty, a man is buried, or human is buried. More pillars, more walls, one more roof, and on top of that, a horse is buried, and a mound of earth above that. This culture in Eurasia was a horse culture. They used to eat horses. 70% of the bones they've found there were horse bones. The shards of pottery actually show biochemical evidence of having contained mare's milk. There's nothing like this. If you look at the Rig Veda, it's all about cow's milk, ghee, nothing about mare's milk at all. And how is this linked to India? Well, here it is. There's this man called David Anthony, who is again very widely quoted. He's written a book called The Horse, Wheel and Language. And what this man has done is he's basically cooked up a verse from the Rig Veda. And the real translation of that verse is up there in small text. You need not bother about it. But this man says, one hymn, Rig Veda 10:18, describes a covered burial chamber with posts holding up the roof, walls shored up, and the chamber sealed with clay. A precise description of Sintashta and Andronovo grave pits. This is nonsense. The verse says nothing about walls and pillars. There's nothing like that. It's just, this is plain concoction. Nowadays, when you look for references for ancient Indian history and languages, you find that people are citing, say, in Wikipedia, or even genetics references for that matter. You find people citing a language called Proto-Indo-European. Now, what linguists have gone and done is to reconstruct a language called Proto-Indo-European. They've taken daughter languages, later modern languages, and known earlier languages, and used a method of reconstruction to make up a hypothetical language called Proto-Indo-European. Now, here's the problem. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European from younger languages is a perfectly reasonable academic exercise, but you're only creating a hypothetical language. It's not a real language. It was never really spoken by anyone. That aside, its place of origin for a hypothetical language would also be imaginary. If it wasn't spoken by anyone, there was no place where it was spoken. But yet, they've gone and invented the language and placed it in the steppe region of Russia. It's not as if all is well with the reconstruction of this language. Language reconstruction is full of arbitrary and inconsistent methods, and lots of personal biases can get in there. I will not go into those details. That's a completely separate subject. But the most astounding thing is the circular argument used with the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, or PIE, where words from daughter languages are used to reconstruct the mother language, and then every time they refer to the mother language and say, oh, these words came from that mother language. I mean, this is like saying, that's like making a cheese sandwich from butter, bread and cheese, and later saying, oh, see, amazing, here's a thing called a sandwich, and from this you get butter, you get bread, and you get cheese. This is astounding, but this is reality. This is what is going on. You will regularly find people telling you, oh, this word from Sanskrit came from Proto-Indo-European. This word from German came from Proto-Indo-European. So this is something we need to be aware of. So we find that despite claiming to be scholars studying language, linguists have constantly dabbled with concocting the history of various peoples. For example, Michael Witzel, a philologist from Harvard, writes about what an ideal Aryan archaeological site would be, and he says something about horses and graves and things like that, whole which I personally think is a load of nonsense. Basically, rebutting Witzel would require as many pages as he writes. His rebuttals are 60, 70, 80, 100 pages long. You'd have to write something that long, so you can only take bits to rebut him, but there's a lot of stuff there. I won't go into that now. And then here is a textbook of comparative Indo-European linguistics, a modern textbook. I've been reading it, and you find that one of the chapters is about the arrival of the Indo-Europeans and the origin of the Indo-Europeans. This person is making up things about arrival and origins in what is supposed to be a linguistics text. This is where we are. We've had our history made up by these people, and this is what we keep propagating. And it's high time we realized this and brought this house of cards down. So, before I conclude, I'd like to say philologists and linguists stand accused of perpetuating historical fallacies by making cosmetic and semantic changes. First they said Aryans and Dravidians were races, and now they say no, we didn't actually mean that. They just this one. It's just a set of languages and which have those names. They also created non-existent languages to buttress untenable theories. For instance, the Avestan language has been only created ignoring known historical facts simply to support the theory of migration of Indo-Iranian languages towards India. So, pre-1000 BCE history of India has been concocted, and languages like PIE created to suit predetermined ideas. And non-linguistic facts have been completely ignored. There are linguists who are on record, famous ones, who are on record saying that anything that's outside of linguistics cannot stand for history, and linguistic history is right, which again is a load of crock, because you look at the sort of evidence that's coming out nowadays. These linguistics statements make no sense. So I'd like to conclude by saying that we need to recognize the role of historical linguists in concocting history. Our leftist historians were merely servile acolytes of Western philologists. And the community of linguists needs to be made accountable for the creation and perpetuation of fake histories. For example, an aerospace engineer who builds an aircraft, he's accountable. If he does nonsense, the aircraft is going to crash. Same thing is true for a doctor. He has to be accountable. But linguists and philologists are just not accountable. They can cook up whatever they like. They get believed. Nothing needs to be proven. No proof is required. This cannot be allowed anymore. Thank you and namaste.